someone who is very untrained and has been eating a poor diet, which typically then would lead, especially in the US, to an obese or an overweight state, they're going to have easier time in general losing body fat. And then when they go from zero to just a reasonable training program, especially if they're geared towards gaining muscle mass, they can do both of those things simultaneously. The changes in the major factors that would promote fat loss and muscle gain basically being your diet and being your training status. The other thing, as I mentioned too, it seems that the more body fat someone has, the easier it is for them to...
You're a man of letters, given you have a PhD, and you're also a man who's not unfamiliar with lifting a few weights and throwing them around the gym. So can we get straight to it and get to that old chestnut, get it out of the way earlier?
Absolutely.
Is it possible to build muscle and lose fat at the same time?
The holy grail? Absolutely. Yes, it is. After someone's been at it, there's several factors. I can kind of outline from this big picture and work our way in. This will happen with someone, we've seen this back in the 50s and 60s, even with education students, PE students who would be part of a study, and they would just go on a jogging program and they would lose body fat and gain muscle mass without even lifting weights. So the factors that are involved there from the broad scheme of things are the changes in the major factors that would promote fat loss and muscle gain, basically being your diet and being your training status. So, for instance, someone who is very untrained and has been eating a poor diet, which typically then would lead, especially in the US, to an obese or an overweight state, they're going to have easier time in general. It's not always the case. There's genetic factors that are involved here. Losing body fat, and then when they go from zero to just a reasonable training program, especially if they're geared towards gaining muscle mass, they can do both of those things simultaneously. There's an energy cost for the muscle mass building process, and that's sort of an unknown quantity. You can theoretically calculate that, but it's definitely possible. There's a nice review article that a good friend, colleague of mine, Chris Barricat, was the head author on. Came out in, I think, in 2022 on this very notion, and he goes through the data in various studies where the group averages actually showed this recomposition effect where they gain muscle, lost body fat simultaneously. And then there's the other important factor is the genetics. So there's a distribution here. So there will be some people who are they have a natural genetic proclivity to put on muscle mass. So tremendous genetics. Some people will just do that. They'll put on muscle mass tremendously. The other thing, as I mentioned too, it seems that the more body fat someone has, the easier it is for them to lose body fat and to put on muscle mass. So there's hope for people that have, through course of fate, genetics, various things, ended up being sort of those who suffered from creeping obesity, as it's known, and they're now in their 40s and 50s, and they slowly, year by year, put on more body fat and lost a little muscle mass. Having more body fat would tend to mean, it's not always the case, but tend to mean someone's further away from their body fat set point, or you can talk about settling points, or even something about these intervention points where the body sort of says, okay, we're going to try to push you back towards whatever the norm is. So the further you're away from that, the more body fat you have, the more readily you can lose body fat. So you take someone who's gotten sort of way out of shape over the course of years, put them on a reasonable diet, and it can even be in hypocaloric diets, so a diet where you're intentionally taking in fewer calories than what you would expect to be expending, and they will lose body fat and then recomposition and put on muscle mass at the same time because the training stimulus is so novel. So it's a novel training stimulus. It's a novel diet. They're finally paying attention to maybe getting enough protein, not eating too much fat, not overeating. This can definitely happen, but it's not everyone's genetic hand, so to speak, to have that tremendous effect. But the more untrained you are, the more body fat may be accumulated away from where your natural, quote-unquote, set point might be, the better your chances.
Okay, so then if you're trying to navigate those two things, whereby you're trying to gain muscle mass or maintain muscle mass while trying to lose weight at the same time, what does your diet look like as far as macronutrient composition is concerned?
Protein, you can there's an increased protein need when you start exercise, even if it's endurance exercise. So roughly, for Americans, we would say a gram of protein per pound. That's at the upper end of the recommendations in grams per kilogram. Something like 1.6 to 2.2 is the number that numerous studies and meta-analyses have come to. So about 2 grams per kilogram. Then you can look at fats and carbs and say, well, about a gram of fat per kilogram and maybe somewhere between 3, 4, 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. That's a little bit hard to reconcile unless you're sort of mathematically gifted. The smart way, the easy, practical way to do that, to build a diet, first figure out, are you trying to intentionally gain muscle mass? That would be very few. Most people want to lose body fat primarily. So start off with those protein requirements, and those numbers can be higher when you're dieting down. And actually, it's to your advantage, especially in a recomposition type of framework, to maybe even go at least be at that gram per pound, 2 grams per kilogram, maybe even 3. There are some studies where they intentionally increase protein requirements above that 2.2 critical value in a dietary, in a hypocaloric context. So more protein can be helpful, with the caveat being, of course, that you have healthy kidneys. That's really the only scenario where more protein is going to be potentially deleterious to your health. Within reason, of course, don't just eat all protein. We don't want to do that. So get that protein basis, gram per pound, 2 to 3 even if you're going to potentially have a diet where you're hypocaloric, you've got a deficit. And then build to your calories. Something, and I usually use American numbers, so sorry if this is a little bit off, but 15 calories per pound is about where most people that are reasonably active, who aren't sitting all the time at work and at home, et cetera, who have normal sort of activities of daily living, would end up being in caloric balance. So you would start a diet. Of course, it's helpful to work with a coach or an RD or someone who's appropriately licensed wherever you may live, with the protein basis, and then figure out what your calories are going to be. And then in large part, you'd want to go with the carbohydrate sources, because we're presuming someone's exercising and the carbs are going to be helpful, especially for resistance exercise. And just make sure you get some fat sources in there. The preferences would be shooting for the more heart-healthy fats, things like salmon, steelhead trout, if you like mackerel, those sorts of things, or at least including a fish oil supplement. And then look for monounsaturated fatty acid sources, and then saturated fats, which are easy to get, especially in the U.S. where we eat red meat like it's going out of style. People are going to have any problem finding saturated fat. You can run into a problem, at least in men, if your saturated fat is really low. So someone who goes on a really strict, hardcore diet and then eliminates saturated fat because they're just like, all I want is the stuff I have to have, the essential fatty acids, they could run potentially into testosterone problem, where testosterone levels dwindle perhaps even more than they would so while you're in your deficit. So let's say someone weighs, we'll make it easy, 200 pounds. So they go with a gram of protein per pound, 200 grams of protein. They want to eat the 200 pounds, their calories per day would be 3,000, roughly, to be in balance. They start off and say, I'm going to go with 2,500. So now they take the difference between 200 grams from protein, so 800 calories, at 2,500, 1,700 calories. Majority of that's going to come from carbohydrates and the rest from healthy fats as much as possible. And here's where the magic comes in. So that's 15 is just an average. There's various equations you can use to predict resting metabolic rate and the energy costs of activities. But there's even an unknown, even with all the things we know about metabolism, there's an unknown energy composition or compensation effect, which the scientists still don't even know what's going on. For instance, when people have massive caloric expenditure, somehow the body will compensate to reduce the overall energy expenditure. In an unknown way, there's this big sort of, it's like there's a black matter issue. Like, we don't know how much mass we have in our caloric universe here, and there's black matter that somehow is unaccounted for. So the solution for that is simply to pay attention to what's happening to your body composition. scales can be someone's enemy. Some people look at the scale and they're like, oh my gosh, and it can really play mind tricks on you. So looking at what's happening potentially with the scale, but if you're recompositioning, and this happens a lot, people can be gaining muscle and losing fat at the same time. So sticking with the dietary caloric intake that seems to be evoking the changes that you want, and then maybe step in with someone who's a personal trainer, someone you can trust, who can do skin folds or a body composition assessment. That's a whole other podcast, multiple podcasts, actually. And then see what happens over time. Don't jump ship after 1 week if you don't all of a sudden, transform into your favorite Instagram model or what have you, right? It's to just based on what happens with your body. When people get more food, sometimes they move around more. There's a non-exercise activity thermogenesis. NEAT is what the acronym is. People talk about NEAT all the time. So if you hear that, now you know what's so neat about NEAT. That will sometimes go down when people become hypocaloric. They get sluggish because they're hungry. So people will count their steps in their phone, for instance, as a surrogate for how much NEAT they have, how about sort of imperceptible activity they have. So the key is just adjusting your diet in a reasonable way. But most importantly, whether you decide to go higher fat, lower carb, you want to do a ketogenic diet, or you're going to go to a carnivore diet, or whatever it might be, the key there is sustainability if you eventually want to get to whatever your goal might be. So it has to be something that is reasonable, that you can sustain and then maintain when you get to where you're going. So
some great points. You actually preempted my next question, because in the context of having interviewed some ketogenic experts in recent weeks on the podcast, and people who are very much into higher protein and carnivores diets, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned there that ideally, if you wanted to build muscle, you needed a fuel source, and that fuel source was a higher carb source. Now, could you tell me how much of a disadvantage would somebody be if they were ascribing to a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet and they were looking to build muscle at the same time?
From practical experience, I've used ketogenic diets literally for years in the past. This was decades ago before they became so popular. And there is some literature out there looking at ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, things of that nature too, where various macronutrients can be limited, or time. There can be a lack, for instance, of protein spacing. That's intermittent fasting. The further you get away from sort of the standard, spread your protein out, have a normal amount of carbohydrate, the less likely you are to be able to make progress. But those are studies where they're prescribing diets to people. You still have adherence issues. So if you were to take someone, for instance, who is just gangbusters, they love the ketogenic diet, there's someone who particularly finds, and I found this too, that being in ketosis limits their appetite. And I really suspect, I haven't seen this borne out in research, but I really suspect there may even be some hormonal actions there. If someone, for instance, is in ketosis, they don't like it makes them feel fuzzy-headed. Some people feel kind of high almost from the state of ketosis. They prefer to be there. Take those two different examples. One person might be running around sort of like, wow, I smell the bakery every time I go outside my house. They're wanting to eat carbs. They're constantly in a state of duress and stress because the diet just doesn't suit them for whatever reasons. Whereas someone else might be, I have found the golden chalice. I have found my answer. I have found my solution. I love eating meat. I love eating fatty foods. I don't crave carbs at all. My diet's totally in control. And they're very, very happy. Those two situations can completely change the success or failure of a particular dietary strategy, either for various reasons, but in large part, either from lack of adherence, they just simply don't follow the diet, or they eat more for whatever reason. There's all sorts of things that can happen psychologically that we're not even aware of per se, or also because of almost placebo effects. Placebo effects are very, very interesting. I've written articles on this as one of my favorite topics. The sort of science behind a placebo effect involves an expectancy, which evokes a dopamine response in the brain. There's actually some genetics. There's at least, like last time I looked, 28, probably more than 28 now, genes that have been associated with a proclivity for a placebo effect. So when someone tells you that this pill or this diet or whatever is going to work, that creates an expectancy. Like, I'm expecting this to work. Of course, you see a good advertisement and you see someone who made this massive transformation. There's an expectancy. That's going to change the nature of many interventions. We've seen, for instance, like in the antidepressant literature, people have begun the efficacy of antidepressants has changed because advertisements about antidepressants have been, they're on the TV here. I don't have a TV. I haven't watched TV for years, but every time I go and I see one of these ads, I'm like, so the placebos have become more and more effective because people don't know what they're getting. If it's a placebo, they don't know which group they're in, but there's a larger expectancy because they see these ads everywhere. So whether or not a particular diet is effective can have these for psychological reasons, adherence reasons. There is, for instance, doing a ketogenic diet, if it's strictly ketogenic and there is no carbohydrate refeeding, and this is a finer point for someone who's maybe more towards a bodybuilder-esque type of person. You're going to lack the energy source that's going to allow for optimal performance in the gym. So one of the things that's associated with this recomp effect is also, I like to say that form and function follow one another. So if you're getting stronger in the gym, that's generally an indicator. There's some neural components there, but you're also going to be gaining muscle. And if your ability to train hard and create that stimulus so that you can get stronger and you can build muscle is limited because you literally are not taking in for weeks or months on end the fuel source, the carbohydrate, which is what's predominantly used during those actual sets of resistance exercise, you're going to limit the stress that you can evoke. But the mind is a powerful thing. If someone's really, really amped, you go into a gym, this is one of the things I think is strongly associated with good adherence to whether it's a diet or a training regimen, what have you. And they look in the mirror and like, I'm doing really well. This is awesome. I like being here. I don't feel like I'm being stared at. I don't feel out of place. This is my home. They're going to train hard, even if they happen to be lacking muscle glycogen. It's not going to matter so much. They might even do more sets and have a more effective training stimulus, but just to get that pulp, which they want, which is more difficult to get without glycogen. So there's going to be some physiological ramifications of not eating carbohydrates, potentially even on the muscle metabolism that's involved. If you look at carbohydrate feedings around resistance exercise sessions, there's not strong evidence showing that acutely, at least, taking in carbs around your workout is that important for protein synthesis. But eventually, when someone gets past that point of that recomposition period, and this is maybe months or maybe even a year down the road, if they want to continue to gain muscle, it becomes more difficult to do so. There's a law of diminishing returns. So you start off, you've not trained, or it's been 20 years since you last trained. You start training, your diet changes, you can drop fat and gain muscle. A year down the road, now you're going to have to, this is where most advanced people, I'm going to have an off season where my focus is on putting on muscle. I'm going to gain some body fat along the way. Then I try to hold on to the muscle and lose the body fat, rinse and repeat, that sort of thing. That probably in that long term is, and this is where I've seen empirically in the trenches as a bodybuilder and working with people for decades now, that not being on a keto diet or at least having some cyclical ketogenic dieting process in place where you do carb up and replace glycogen. There's actually a study that was done with ketogenic dieting. They had a very bizarre training regime, and it was not very effective in producing muscle mass compared to a standard carb-containing diet. But it wasn't the type of cyclical ketogenic diet that people who do these types of diets typically do, where they've got their training structured very carefully to make sure they don't train more than maybe twice without having a carb up in between. So there's a difference between just training with no carbs for months on end versus being sure that you carb up, replace that glycogen, restore that performance capability so you can continue to train hard. That's a very strategic tip. It's a ketogenic diet, technically speaking. versus just ketogenic in someone who's never really trained before, and you just let them run out of glycogen for weeks and weeks on end. So context is everything. With the newbies, the other thing that's worth mentioning too, with looking at a lot of these studies, is you can have a ceiling effect. And this is, and you see this kind of when you're talking about this recomposition. People are doing almost the impossible. This is why you're asking this question. They're losing fat and gaining muscle at the same time. I thought you needed caloric excess to gain. How can you lose fat, caloric deficit, and gain muscle, caloric excess at the same time? It's so novel. The body is using its fat stores as the energy for the quote-unquote caloric excess, the excess energy needed to build muscle. So
I was just thinking
lots of food for thought there.
There's a lot in there. There's some points I want to come back to, but you mentioned being in the trenches there. And as I said at the outset, you're an experienced bodybuilder and weightlifter down through the years. That requires an awful lot of time commitment and energy commitment. I suppose when we're talking today, we're talking to a broader audience. So for them, time might be more of a premium. So in that respect, they won't be able to engage in things like drop sets, supersets, and eccentric loading and things like that whenever they're in the gym in order to maintain or build muscle. So what kind of exercises would you advise people out there, either the newbies, the people who are trying to maintain, or indeed people who are north of 40 years of age who are trying to hold on to that muscle mass that unfortunately people tend to lose once they hit 30, 35 and above? Are compound exercises the best use of their time?
It's interesting you mention supersets and drop sets. Actually, those can be time savers.
Oh, okay.
Indeed. For instance, if let's say you want to, one of the things that can happen when you have short rest intervals, so you're time crunched, is that you can potentially, the literature sort of suggests this without going into the finer details, that you can potentially compromise the stimulus because that muscle is fatigued, because the loads you can use are less. There's a volume intensity relationship that's a little more detailed that we don't have time to get into. But let's say that, so you want to train your back and then your chest alternately, and that's sort of a superset. That can be done because you train back once, and then you train chest, either right after the other, and you just put two sets, one right after the other, and then you have a minute and a half, 2 minutes rest. You come back and do back and chest. Compare that with back, 2 minutes, back, 2 minutes, and now you've actually saved time because you coupled two muscle groups, in this case, antagonistic muscle groups to one another. Supersets or drop sets or cluster sets. There's actually a number of different cluster sets people can do. These are basically it's a set extension type of regime where you would go to failure or go close to failure, take a small break. And the idea is that you accrue some volume and maybe you come closer or stay further away from failure. And you allow fatigue to accumulate so that you can do those sets in a fatigue state, do those reps in a fatigue state that are the most effective. So this idea that if you do a set of 10 reps, those first 5 reps really might not do much for you, but the last 5 are the really effective ones because those are the ones that are really difficult. That's where you're actually creating the stimulus because you're doing something you haven't tried to do before. So you can do drop sets potentially or various times cluster sets, where you basically allow either you drop the weight down and you do fewer reps, but they're all very hard. So then you accrue, instead of 3, 4, 5 reps that are effective in one set, you might do a drop set and gather 7, 8, or 9 reps that are effective. Or you might do a cluster set that takes 2 minutes in total, but you gather together 8, if you can quantify it this way. It's not a black and white thing, but you might get 8 effective reps out of that cluster set, as opposed to just 3 if you did a normal straight set where you just started and went until the end of the set, be that failure or not. So what is more important than that, though, I just wanted to throw that in as a side. Everyone's going to have the extent to which they want to work hard. My mom, for instance, I mentioned her, she wants to be distracted by her personal trainer. She doesn't enjoy going in and torturing herself by picking things up and putting them down repeatedly. I kind of consider that an unnatural act unless you have some screws loose in your head like I do. It's a very bizarre thing. Why would you it's a hack of your muscle physiology to try to evoke a muscular callus, i.e. muscle hypertrophy, right? So it's a bizarre thing to do that. Some people like it. Some people, they like to go on, they like to challenge themselves. They like to see the weights moving upward. They like to have a logbooks so they can monitor that. And then other people, they're willing to do it, but they don't just relish their time in the gym. So knowing where someone is on that spectrum is, I think, important to know. This is how hard I'm willing to train. And then look back. You can work with the trainer on this. Sometimes a trainer will just help you get past. Trainers, a lot of times in the gym, will just help you train harder than you would otherwise. And they get you in there. There's some accountability. But figure out where you are. This is my opinion, at least. Figure where you are in terms of how hard you want to train. And then what is sustainable, generally speaking, in terms of how hard and how much you want to train. 3 times a week, 6 times a week, 2 hours at a shot, no more than half an hour. And then, of course, build in some practical lifestyle breaks. So is your training program, does it allow you, like I have a training system, fortitude training it's called, and it has deload periods built in that you can actually introduce, let's say when you want to go on a vacation. And the program is set up specifically to allow people, if they want to train on their vacation, to continue and stick with the program. The program is, to follow the program, you're supposed to auto-regulate and ramp down your volume or ramp up your volume or change the program based on how you feel. So you have to have some flexibility in there. Some people love being the soldier. I get up every day at 4 a.m. and I have my coffee and then I rise and I grind and they go. Other people are like, no, I need to be able to like say, all right, I'm going to take a step back here, have some time off, take a vacation. I don't want to work out on my vacation. I worked out so I can look good on my vacation and just, have drinks on the sand. So everyone's different. So figure out where you are, something that you enjoy at least. There's some immediate gratification I think is very important. And that's what matters. I could give you the perfect prescription of how you would, how many sets and volume and progressive overload and what have you. But if that doesn't float your boat, it doesn't matter because you won't keep doing it. Adherence is really poor for most exercise programs. I'm sure you know this. It's, close to 9 out of 10 people will drop out after the course of a year. The gyms know this. They hire everyone on at New Year's, right? And then, 80+% of them are gone. They know this. They do it intentionally. They don't say, oh, please come back and work out again. They just want your money at the beginning of the year. So that's, I think, the most important thing is to figure out what it is that you want to do. And then once you figure that out, make it the most effective program that you can, depending on how hard you want to train. So the real limitations to how you construct your training program are in your head. And if you find a decent trainer, he can help you construct something that's as effective given what your personal parameters are.
On that, you mentioned ceilings earlier on. Ceilings remind me of plateaus. Everybody experiences a plateau, as you said earlier, at some point in their fitness journey. How do you navigate those plateaus? How do you keep that motivation going?
It's going to depend on the person. So I think the first thing is to be honest and ask oneself, okay, why is there a plateau? A question I get so often, I go out and I'm in public and someone will say, hey, I ask you some fitness questions. I used to work out all the time, what have you. And like, what do I need to do with my diet? And the first thing I will say is like, okay, let's look at your diet and your training. What are the 5 things you could be doing, or you should stop doing in order to get closer to where you'd like to go in terms of your fitness? They're like, what do you mean? I said, just anything. You know the answers to these questions. They're like, well, I do have a few too many beers on the weekend. And yeah, we have pizza like every Thursday and I probably eat, probably twice what I should. I'm like, yeah, so that's maybe an extra 1,000. Oh, at least an extra 1,000 calories. Well, your fat loss goals are going to basically be cut in half or completely negated if you're doing that every week. So when someone comes to a plateau, the question is, okay, where does the plateau lie? Is it in my diet? Do I need to reduce my calories to lose more fat? Do I need to take in more protein? Do I need to cut out the cheat meals? So is it in the training? Is it in the diet? Or is it in your lifestyle? So for instance, some people might recognize, when they get up in the morning, they have to train in the morning because they have a 9 to 5 job. and they're just dragging butt, and they tend to stay up and look at their phone too long, and they lose an hour of sleep every night. And sleep is very, very important. In that review article by Barakat et al., they talk about sleep being an important factor potentially for this recomposition effect, just to have the recovery available. And not sleeping well has a multitude of of awful effects on your body. So figure out what that is and then address that. And it might be, yep, it's time to make a shift in my diet. I need to drop my diet down, cut calories a bit more. My training maybe I need to dial things back. Some people are training too hard and they're not progressing in the gym. It's not the end all be all, but if you keep doing what you've been doing in the gym, you're going to keep looking the way you've been looking. So if you are doing incline presses with 200 pounds, doing squats with 300 pounds, and deadlifts with 250 pounds or what have you, and you want to look more like the person who can lift 50% more on those lifts, then you may need to focus more on your progressive overload. And then you would reconstruct your training to allow that. Allow for deloads, periodize things in some way, focus more on the progressive overload, and recognize, okay, if I'm not making progress for 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, something needs to change. The volume's too high, the effort's not high enough, or maybe I need a deload, so I need to periodize in some way, perhaps. So figure out where it is, and then most of the time, people will know what the changes are off the top of their head if they're honest with themselves.
If I said to you, look, you can only give somebody one exercise they can do from here until the end of time, what would that one exercise be?
The one they want to do.
Great answer. Great answer.
Yeah. Because I used to I'll tell you a funny story. Maybe that answer was shorter than what you expected. We had a professor who passed away, but I was a college professor at Cal Poly Pomona many moons ago, and one of the professors passed, and I was actually able to teach weight training. I was really happy to do that, not under those circumstances, of course. And I taught the students how to do deadlifts and squats, which you don't typically get in a college weight training class. You use machines or what have you, but we were out in this old barn and there wasn't much there. And I remember teaching them deadlifts, and I said, if I were on a deserted island and I only had one exercise I would probably do deadlifts and pick up the palm trees. And they used to look at me like, this guy's out of his mind. Why would you lift if you're on a deserted island? That's my personal way of doing things, like, because the deadlifts evoke a major metabolic demand. You're training almost all the muscles of the body, but that's me. Most of the guys in that class would have said, well, bench press. You got to have a big chest. That's what the ladies like, right? So whatever they want to do is the one. So it's totally up to the person, I think. For women, it might be like a glute bridge or maybe a deep squat because they want their booty to look the way they want it to. So it depends on some people just want to be strong. Deadlift is a great marker of strength. You know, people say oftentimes, what do you squat or what do you bench? That's the question you get when you walk around. It's like, the question is, what do I deadlift? And I could deadlift 600 pounds. They're like, wow. For someone else, they don't care. You know, curls for the girls. They just do bicep curls so their arms look good in a short sleeve shirt. So it's totally up to the person, I think.
Let's talk about supplementation. It seems that there's protein in everything these days. There's whey protein isolates in your local supermarkets now, and there's protein bars of every description. There's creatine. There's all these things. Is supplementation necessary, or can you get all of the nutrients from a whole food diet?
You really can get most everything from a whole food diet. I don't think it's a bad idea to use a multivitamin, maybe a food-based multivitamin. I don't have any products I'm going to plug. But I think you can get most everything. Sometimes it's helpful with busy lifestyles to have a protein supplement. Creatine seems to be fairly effective. That one's been studied for many, many moons now. People like to do everything they can. When someone really starts getting in to training and taking care of their diet, eventually it's sort of like a car. If you're a car enthusiast and you're working in your garage on your car and you're like, okay, I painted it, I changed the oil, what can I do next? I want to do something more. Like, okay, I'm going to jack it up a little bit, or I'm going to reupholster the inside or whatever it might be. And supplements, I think, help keep enthusiasm up because it's a way to sort of add some bells and whistles. But mostly these are bells and whistles. Nutrient timing could make a difference. Making sure you get in some nutrition pre and during your workout can potentially help. I've been a big fan of that as a way, especially if someone's trying to add calories, to sort of basically do a double duty with adding calories and not losing time, taking in a meal. You can literally take in a meal while you're working out. So that's something that help people. But most of your listeners, I think, are probably going to want to be dieting down. Actually, when dieting down, it's been my opinion that meal is also an important one, just to maintain some nutrients throughout the day. And that's when you have the greatest nutrient turnover. Even as small, they demonstrate this in studies, as little as 6 grams of essential amino acids. That's calorically, that's nothing, can have a positive impact on protein synthesis, brought on by a resistance exercise session. So, those acute studies don't necessarily mean massive gains at the end, but these are the little things that can potentially add up. If you do all those little things versus do none of those little things, I think you can make a difference, at least for some people. But for the most part, supplements are supposed to supplement. And we're looking for magic bullets many times, and it's fun to look for those, and it's fun to get excited about those things. And it's not as exciting to say, okay, I'm going to get some mixed vegetables today with my meal. I'm going to make sure I have my servings of fruit, what have you. For instance, you don't see longevity effects from multivitamins and multivitamins, at least epidemiologically, but you do from eating more fruits and vegetables.
As I said at the outset, you're a man of letters, you're a man of science, and you have years' experience in gyms as a bodybuilder and a weightlifter. You're probably the diametric opposite of many of the new generation of, what would we call them, influencers and gurus, fitness gurus online. The internet is full of these people espousing their own methods, their own various philosophies when it comes to fitness and weightlifting. I really want to get your take on this because, as I said, you have a lot of experience. Yeah. What is is there one common piece of fitness advice that when you see it makes you cringe?
Let me think about that's a good question. Makes me cringe. There's so many myths out there. There's a Buddhist saying, if you meet a Buddha in the road, I say this so often, so I feel like I'm just sort of repeating myself, and I am, but with good reason. If you meet a Buddha in the road, shoot him. That doesn't mean you should kill anybody. No firearm should be involved. But if someone comes to you and says, I've got your answer, I'm the Buddha, I'm the one who tells you how it works, that's the first thing that you want to think, okay, you actually are your own Buddha. When it comes down to it, we all, unless somehow you're imprisoned, in the matrix for real, and people are telling you how to think, you have the choice to believe someone or not believe someone. And when someone says, I got the answer, I'm the one, and they don't, somehow they try to lure you in to give up your own ability to think for yourself, which is sort of what happens here. There's very, very slick cults of personality type of individuals out there. That's the thing that makes me think, this he's giving people easy black and white answers. And most of the answers are actually, it depends, in my book, at least. So as you've noticed, like here, every time, like almost every answer I could have just said, it depends, without going into detail. And that would have been the right intro. So when someone gives you black and white without some of the subtle nuances, that's the thing, like, people want that. It's so much nicer to have a black and white. Okay, I don't have to think for myself. That is almost like a hypnotist's way of getting people to buy products and what have you. And that kind of makes me cringe, because I think you're stealing away people's autonomy. And even back in the days before, when I was just personal training and going through grad school, before I, was doing what I do now, my goal was always to get people to where they could be autonomous and make their own decisions, be their own bodybuilding coach, be their own personal trainer. And the folks that you mentioned before, that is it's sort of the opposite of that. They want to become the end all be all to some degree. And it makes sense. This is how you sell more product. Every time someone comes out with a new product, people just buy it because they have to. When people are taking that, are sort of putting themselves out there as the prophet, as the end all be all, as the Buddha, as the guru. It's a 4-letter word, right? In my mind, at least. That's what makes me kind of cringe. It's like, oh man, because especially from my experience level, you mentioned having been around for a while. Sometimes I can see through their veils pretty well, and I can see sometimes when there's misinformation or lack of subtlety of information because they're painting a black and white picture when there's multiple shades of gray there. And I'm like, oh, people are gonna love that. They're gonna gobble it up like nothing, and they're missing out on some important information. So that makes me cringe when I see that, when people are being taken advantage of in that way.
I love your common sense approach. You're very direct, and it's just logical, really. And as I said, it comes from a place of many years of experience, both in the gym and as a scientist. What I want to do is I want to link your book, Be Your Own Bodybuilder, in the show notes of this episode, and people can find it there. Okay. And where can people find you online if they want to seek out more about you?
My podcast is called Muscle Minds. It's on YouTube. It's part of the Think Big network, so people can see that there's hundreds of those. I do lots of podcasts, so you can just Google Scott Stevenson bodybuilding, and you'll find me all over the place. And then Instagram, fortitude_training is my Instagram handle. People can find me there too.
And we'll link those in the show notes to Dr. Scott Stevenson. Thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed listening to your answers.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was fun.
Hey, if you like that video, check out this video here, which tells you how to get rid of that stubborn belly fat.